The first time she came to our door, the afternoon light fell behind her like a halo, soft, almost holy. And I remember thinking, no one should look that gentle standing in front of so much ruin. My marriage had already cracked in places I refused to see, and yet when she smiled, I felt something shift, like the air itself had forgotten how to breathe. She was just my son's teacher. That's what I kept telling myself. But somewhere between the parent meetings and the quiet laughter that filled my empty kitchen, I stopped being a father, waiting for help, and became a man crossing a line I swore I never would. If stories like this remind you how easily love turns into something unrecognizable, how the smallest kindness can become the most dangerous thing, then stay, subscribe, listen, and remember, every secret begins with a single moment that feels harmless, until it isn't. The night it began, the house was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that hums just beneath your skin, reminding you of every word left unsaid. My wife, Lara, had texted an hour earlier, "Working late again? Don't wait up." And I'd already stopped replying with anything more than, "Okay." That was the season of our marriage when even kindness sounded rehearsed. My son, Noah, had fallen asleep on the couch, a half-finished drawing sprawled across his lap, 2 stick figures under a crooked sun, one holding a balloon. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it broke something small inside me. Then came the knock. Soft, deliberate, and uncertain. The kind that makes you pause before answering. When I opened the door, she stood there, framed by the porch light and rain, her umbrella dripping steady tears onto the doormat. Ms. Evelyn Hart, my son's new art teacher. She wasn't supposed to look like that, calm, composed, carrying a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes, they carried the same tiredness I'd seen in my own reflection too many times. "I'm sorry for coming by so late," she said, her voice quiet, but sure. "I wanted to talk to you about Noah. I've noticed he's withdrawn." For a moment, I didn't answer. I just watched the rain slide down her coat, catching the glimmer of light like falling glass. I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in, telling myself it was just good manners, that a teacher visiting her student's home wasn't unusual. But even then, I felt the shift, that subtle tension in the air, like something fragile had just woken up between us. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and dust. She glanced around, the framed photos of happier years, the cluttered counter, the lamp that flickered when it rained. She smiled politely, the kind of smile you give when you're trying not to look too long. I offered her a seat and coffee, and she accepted with a nod, setting her damp umbrella by the door. She spoke about Noah, how he was quiet in class, how he drew people with their faces turned away, how he flinched when someone raised their voice. I listened, nodding, pretending this was just about him. But as she spoke, I realized she wasn't just describing my son. She was describing me. The distance, the silence, the unspoken things that lingered long after the arguments ended. At some point, the conversation drifted from Noah to life, the kind of small talk that feels safe until it isn't. She told me she'd moved here recently. That teaching was the one thing that still made sense after her own heartbreak. I didn't ask what that meant, but her eyes told me enough. We were both broken people trying to sound whole. When I poured her another cup of coffee, our hands brushed. It wasn't dramatic, just skin meeting skin for a fraction of a second, but it felt louder than anything either of us said that night. I remember her looking down, smiling faintly, whispering, "Thank you," like she was apologizing for something that hadn't happened yet. The rain outside softened to a drizzle. The clock ticked past midnight. My son stirred on the couch, mumbling in his sleep, and she glanced toward him with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "He's sweet," she said. "He draws people holding balloons. That means he still believes things can fly." I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to believe that the person I'd become, the one who worked, slept, and stared through his own life, could still feel something real. But when I looked at her, I already knew I'd let something dangerous in. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated by the door. The air felt heavy between us. dense with something unnamed. "I hope I didn't overstep," she said softly. "I just care about him." "You didn't," I replied. My voice was low, almost hollow. "Thank you for coming," she smiled, small and unsure. "Good night, Mr. Hale." And then she was gone, down the steps, into the rain, her umbrella a dark silhouette against the streetlight. I closed the door, but her presence stayed in the room, lingering like the smell of wet paper and jasmine. That night, after I carried my son to bed and turned off the lights, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the untouched coffee in her cup. The surface had cooled, forming a thin film that caught the reflection of the ceiling light, smooth, still, deceptive. I didn't know it yet, but that knock had cracked something open. Not loudly, not visibly, but quietly, like rot beneath a painted wall. The kind that doesn't show until it's too late. And as I went to bed beside a woman who no longer asked how my day had been, I found myself thinking not of my wife, not of work, not of anything real, but of the teacher who had stood in my doorway and looked at me as if she saw something worth saving. And that was the beginning of everything I would later ruin. At first, I told myself her visits were harmless. Teachers care about their students. That's all it was. Evelyn came by once more that week, then again the next. Each time she'd bring something small, something that justified her presence. A notebook Noah left behind, a drawing he'd made in class, a progress sheet she said needed to be signed. But beneath every reason was the same quiet energy that hung between us like the faint hum of a light bulb about to burn out. It's strange how quickly something can start to feel normal, how the unusual begins to fit neatly into your days. She'd text before coming, polite as ever. "Is now a bad time?" I'd tell myself it wasn't, that I was doing nothing wrong. But even then, I was checking the clock before she arrived, fixing my shirt, clearing the table. Little rituals I couldn't explain, not even to myself. Noah liked her. He'd light up when she spoke to him, his eyes softer, his drawings brighter. For the first time in months, he seemed free. I convinced myself that was reason enough to keep her close, that her presence was good for him. It was easier to believe that lie than admit how much I looked forward to her voice filling the quiet spaces of my home. One evening, the sky had that pale golden tint that only lasts a few minutes before sunset. She sat at the kitchen table helping Noah paint while I washed the dishes, pretending not to watch her. She leaned close to him, her hair falling over her shoulder, her laughter light and unguarded. The sound of it stirred something deep in me, something I hadn't felt in years. When Noah ran upstairs to wash his hands, we were left alone in that amber silence. She traced the rim of the mug between her fingers, eyes following the brushstrokes on the paper drying by the window. "He's got your eyes," she said quietly. I looked at her. And his mother's patience. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "That's rare." She said it softly, but there was an ache in her tone, as if she was speaking from a place that had long forgotten patience too. I wanted to ask her what had hurt her, what kind of man had left her sounding like that, but I didn't, because I already knew how those stories end. Instead, I asked if she wanted another coffee. She nodded, and when I handed her the cup, our fingers brushed again. This time, neither of us looked away. The silence stretched between us, heavy and alive. After that night, the boundaries thinned. She stayed longer each time, sometimes until the moonlight pooled across the floor. We started talking less about Noah and more about everything else. Childhood, loneliness, the quiet terror of waking up beside someone who feels like a stranger. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something smaller, something more dangerous. Recognition. She told me once that she painted to quiet her thoughts, that colors made more sense than people. I told her I used to write before life got too loud. We laughed at how both of us had traded our passions for routine, how we'd become versions of ourselves that didn't feel entirely real anymore. One night, she brought a small box of art supplies as a gift for Noah. "He draws the world like he's still hoping it'll say sorry," she said. I remember those words because they cut too close. I watched her as she arranged the brushes and paints on the table, her hands graceful, her movements deliberate. There was a steadiness in her, the kind that draws you in without meaning to. When Laura came home later that night, I felt her presence before I heard her voice, the familiar rustle of keys, the click of heels that no longer hurried. Evelyn gathered her things quickly, polite as always, her smile rehearsed. Laura greeted her with the kind of detached warmth you give a stranger. They exchanged pleasantries, short and stiff, and for a moment, I saw the faintest flicker of curiosity in my wife's eyes, the kind that notices too much. After Evelyn left, Laura didn't say anything. She went straight upstairs, her silence sharper than any argument. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the spot where Evelyn's cup had been. The smell of jasmine lingered faintly, caught in the air like a secret refusing to leave. The next morning, Noah showed me a new drawing. 3 figures this time, one holding a balloon, another standing close beside them, and a third farther away, half faded, like they didn't belong in the same world. "That's your teacher, huh?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, smiling. "She makes the colors happy again," he said. That sentence stayed with me all day, because in a way, she was doing the same to me. Over the following weeks, the lines continued to blur. She'd come by after class, sometimes without a reason, and I'd let her. Sometimes we'd talk, sometimes we'd just sit in silence, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. There were moments when her hand brushed mine, moments when her gaze lingered too long, each one small enough to deny but strong enough to remember. It was never planned, never spoken. But the heart doesn't need permission, it only needs repetition. And by the time I realized how far we'd drifted, it was already too late to pretend we were just 2 adults trying to help a child. That evening, when she stood by the door with her coat half on, she looked at me with something raw in her eyes. "We're walking a thin line, you know," she said. "I know," I replied, though I didn't move. She hesitated, then whispered, "Then why does it feel like falling?" The words hung there, trembling. And for a moment, I thought about pulling back, closing the door, ending it before it began. But instead, I just watched her leave, watched the rain start to fall again, and told myself I could still control this. But the truth is, control had already left the room the first night she knocked. And as the days blurred into weeks, I began to wait for her footsteps more than I waited for my wife's voice. I should have seen where it was heading. But I didn't. Or maybe I did. And I just didn't want to stop. Because when something feels like life returning to you, it's hard to believe it might also be the beginning of your undoing. It happened on a weekend that felt too quiet for its own good. Laura had taken Noah to her mother's for 2 days, a last-minute trip, she said, to clear her head. I didn't argue. Maybe a part of me knew she was already slipping away, that our marriage had become a house where the walls still stood but the warmth had long escaped through the cracks. When the door closed behind them, the silence felt both foreign and familiar. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. Or at least I thought I was. Evelyn texted that afternoon. "I left something for Noah at school. Can I drop it off?" It should have been easy to say no. Instead, I typed, "Sure." 2 letters that would come to haunt me. When she arrived, the sun was already beginning to fall behind the houses. She wore a light gray sweater, her hair tied loosely, raindrops clinging to the edges like they didn't want to let go. She stepped inside without the usual politeness, as if the routine had worn away the pretense. In her hands was a sketchbook bound with a red string. "He's been drawing stories," she said softly. "I thought you'd want to see." We sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where everything had begun. I flipped through Noah's drawings page by page. There were houses, trees, faces half done. But near the end, he'd drawn a picture of 3 figures again. A man, a woman, and another woman beside him, her hand reaching for his. This time, the colors bled together. It made my chest tighten. Evelyn noticed too. "He sees more than we think," she murmured. I looked up at her then, really looked. Her eyes were soft, guarded but not cold. There was a sadness there that mirrored my own, a kind of quiet hunger for something simple and human. "He's just a kid," I said, trying to sound calm. "He draws what he feels. And what do you feel?" she asked. The question hung in the air like a match struck too close to dry wood. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came, because the truth, that I felt seen, wanted, alive again, sounded too much like betrayal. The rain started again outside, gentle at first, then heavier. The sound filled the silence we couldn't. Evelyn set the sketchbook aside, her fingers brushing mine by accident. Or maybe not. It was the smallest touch, but it felt like stepping off the edge of something we'd both been circling for weeks. She whispered, "We shouldn't." "I know," I said. But neither of us moved. The next few seconds felt infinite, her breath close, the rain thrumming on the windows, the faint ticking of the clock marking the moment our lives began to unravel. I didn't pull away when her hand stayed on mine. I didn't stop her when she leaned closer. It wasn't passion at first. It was relief, like two broken people holding on to each other just to remember what warmth felt like. When our lips finally met, it was quiet, almost hesitant. A soft collision of guilt and need. The world didn't stop. There was no cinematic music, no thunderclap of destiny, just the sound of rain and the dull ache in my chest that told me I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. Afterward, we sat there, silent. She looked down, fingers trembling slightly, as if she'd been caught doing something shameful. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But we both knew that was a lie. Because once you touch something forbidden, it doesn't fade. It lingers, stains everything it touches. She left soon after, her footsteps echoing against the porch as the rain eased. I watched from the window as she disappeared into the night, and for a moment, I thought I saw her wipe a tear away. I wanted to tell myself it was the rain, but I knew better. That night I sat in the dark, the house too still. I could still feel her in the room, the warmth where she'd stood, the faint trace of her perfume. I told myself it was just a mistake. One moment of weakness, but guilt doesn't listen to reason. It sits in your stomach like a stone, heavy and alive. The next day, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. But every message, every glance, every silence between us carried the weight of that night. At school pickup, she avoided my eyes, speaking to Noah with her usual gentleness, but her voice wavered slightly when she said goodbye. I caught her reflection in the car window as she turned away, distant, fragile, human. Days passed. We didn't talk about it, but silence has its own language. One evening, she called, just to check in. Her voice on the phone sounded tired. "I can't stop thinking about it," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to, and then, as if fate were cruelly efficient, Lara began to notice. She started asking small questions. "You've been distracted lately. Who keeps texting this late? Why are you always out of reach when I call?" Each question was a thread pulling at the seams of my carefully folded lies. I told myself I'd end it. That I'd choose my family, make it right. But I didn't. Because the truth was, part of me didn't want to. The part that had been starved of warmth for so long clung to Evelyn like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. We met again. Once, then twice. Each time more reckless, more certain that what we were doing couldn't last. Yet each time we convinced ourselves it was different, that it meant something, that it was love. But love doesn't come dressed in shadows and whispered apologies. It comes with light, and ours only existed where no one could see. On our last night together, she looked at me and said, "We're just ghosts haunting a life that isn't ours." Her eyes shimmered with something close to pain. "You have a family. He has you. I can't keep doing this," I wanted to argue, to tell her that she'd become my only truth. But before I could speak, she kissed me one last time. Soft, trembling final. When she pulled away, she whispered, You'll hate me one day. Maybe that's the only way you'll forgive yourself." And then she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark and waited for dawn, but when it came, it felt hollow. I'd thought the hardest part would be losing her. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how easy it had been to lose myself. The morning after Evelyn walked away, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, seemed louder, sharper, as if the walls themselves were aware of what I'd done. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the coffee pot, watching the slow drip, the steam curling upward. It felt absurd that the world still moved, that ordinary things could still exist after something so quietly catastrophic. When Lara came home that afternoon with Noah, she looked different. Not angry, not suspicious, just distant, like someone watching life from behind glass. She hugged Noah tightly, then kissed me on the cheek. It should have felt familiar. Instead, it burned. Her touch felt like mercy I didn't deserve. That night, she asked me if I was happy. No accusation, no bitterness, just a quiet question that cut deeper than any fight could. I lied. Of course I did. "I'm just tired," I said. She nodded, her eyes searching mine for something she couldn't find. When she turned away, I felt something inside me fracture for good. For a few days, I tried to live like before, to erase Evelyn's name from my mind, to be a husband again, a father again. But guilt doesn't fade with distance, it echoes. Every place she'd touched, every word she'd said, every glance that had lingered, they replayed like a song I couldn't shut off. I'd drive by her school and feel my chest tighten. I'd pass a cafe we'd once sat in and feel my pulse stutter. It was like living in a city where every street still whispered her name. Then came the night Lara found out. It wasn't a dramatic reveal, no yelling or broken dishes, just quiet discovery, the kind that wounds without spectacle. She'd borrowed my laptop for work, and somewhere between old photos and cached messages, she found a thread. A message from Evelyn that began simply, "I miss you." When I came home, the house was still. Lara sat at the table, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. She didn't look up when I entered. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly, her wedding ring glinting as she gripped the edge of the table. I tried to speak, but words failed. I managed to whisper, "A few months." She laughed then, not the kind that carries humor, but disbelief. "A few months," she repeated, as if saying it out loud would shrink it into something survivable. Was it worth it? The question hit me harder than any accusation could. I opened my mouth to answer, but there was no truth that wouldn't break her further. I could have said it was a mistake, that I'd been lonely, that I didn't mean for it to happen. But all of that felt small compared to what I'd done, so I said nothing. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the moment love turned into something colder. Not hate, not yet, but the kind of emptiness that leaves no room for forgiveness. "You've destroyed something you'll never rebuild," she said softly. "And you did it for a woman who will vanish the moment you're left alone with your guilt." She wasn't wrong. The days after were blur. She moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when necessary. Noah sensed it too. The tension, the silence. One evening he asked, "Did I do something wrong?" That question, that innocent voice, nearly undid me. I wanted to tell him the truth, that it wasn't his fault, that the person who'd failed was me. But how do you explain to a child that his father broke something sacred for a feeling he mistook for salvation? Evelyn reached out once after everything fell apart. She called, her voice fragile through the static. "She knows, doesn't she?" she asked. I couldn't even answer. She sighed, a sound that seemed to carry every mistake between us. "I'm leaving town," she said finally. "You should try to fix what's left." But what was left to fix? After that silence, weeks turned to months. Lara moved out, taking Noah with her to her mother's. The house grew emptier, quieter, until it felt like punishment itself. I'd wake up to the sound of nothing, no footsteps, no laughter, just the ghosts of a life I'd ruined with my own hands. Sometimes I'd sit at the kitchen table where it all began, tracing the faint ring her coffee cup had left on the wood. It was still there, faint but permanent, a quiet scar. I'd wonder if she thought about me, if she missed what we'd had, or if she'd buried it deep enough to start over. But mostly, I wondered when the guilt would stop feeling so alive. One evening, months later, I attended Noah's school art show. Laura was there, standing across the room, distant but calm. When our eyes met, she gave me a polite nod, the kind people give to strangers they used to know. On the wall beside her hung one of Noah's drawings, a house under a gray sky, 3 figures, 1 inside, 2 outside, standing apart. The one inside was smaller, holding a balloon. Above it, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Maybe one day." I stood there for a long time, staring at that picture. It wasn't anger or sadness that broke me then. It was recognition. The painful truth that my son had drawn what I'd left him. Distance. Confusion, a world split in 2. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that adults sometimes mistake their hunger for love, their loneliness for meaning, that sometimes we ruin the things we love most because we're too afraid to face the emptiness inside ourselves. But words can't rebuild what silence destroyed. So I just watched him from across the room. The way he smiled when his teacher praised his work, the way he looked for his mother in the crowd. And I realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't something I'd ever earn. Maybe it was something I'd learn to live without. Later that night, when I returned to the house, I opened Noah's old sketchbook. The last page was blank. I took a pencil and drew 3 stick figures, 1 holding a balloon, 1 standing behind, 1 watching from far away. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe it was my way of saying I still remembered how things were before everything fell apart. The rain began outside again, soft, endless, familiar. I closed the sketchbook and whispered into the silence, "I'm sorry." No one answered, but for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like truth, because some secrets don't end in redemption, only in understanding. And mine began with a knock at the door I should have never opened.